with your intro at least, because I know your intro takes like a minute. So go ahead.
Greeting mortals, peers, and queers. Here's another debate. It's going to be a little bit shorter today because I'm really busy working on college and work. So, today we're going to be arguing over the origin of evil. And with that, I will go ahead and turn over to my interlocutor and ask them a few starting questions. So, you're a
Sure.
religious person.
Yeah.
Is your God omnipotent? Is your God all powerful?
Yeah.
Okay. Is your God omnibenevolent, all loving?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Is your God omniscient, all knowing?
Yep.
Okay. We've established the core premises of my argument. Okay. So, my argument is that your God cannot be all powerful and all loving while evil exists.
Sure.
So, Epicurus, I think, said it best, so I'll just quote him real quick.
Okay.
Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? If he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? And I think that is a solid part, so I will turn it over to you.
Sure. I disagree with Epicurus' take. I mean, he makes it a pretty open-ended question where he says, if these qualities are true, then how can this be? So I don't think it's necessarily a dilemma of sorts. He kind of understands that there's possibly an answer for this, that it's definitely an inquiry of why evil exists. I would respond with the assumption that evil is unnecessary to an extent. I think is a false one. At least I don't think it's a provable one. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, so you don't think? Let me try and understand here.
Sure.
You're arguing that we can't understand that evil is unnecessary?
Well, I mean, the fundamental assumption of this dilemma is that this evil is an unnecessary one, right? Like why is there unnecessary suffering if God could simply extinguish it and make it cease to exist, right? Like that is necessarily the claim.
Yeah, essentially. Why do innocents suffer unnecessarily if
Sure.
they're supposed to be a all powerful and loving God?
Sure. So are you bringing up the fact that they're innocent to say, or to kind of allude to the fact that it's unnecessary, or
Uh,
would you agree that it's
them
possible that
being
they're
innocent would kind of, to my mind, highlight the fact that it's unnecessary. Of course, we can
why would it be
construe.
unnecessary?
Well, because we can construe some sort of idea that some measure of sort of like punishment for people who've done wrong can be justified in some way. But take children dying of cancer. They're innocent, and their suffering seems wholly unnecessary. If there is
Well,
a
I
loving
think
God
you're.
that
I
has the
think
power to prevent it.
Yeah, but I think you're making a conflation. I think that it being a form of justice versus it being some form of necessity are two separate things. I believe that it's justified out of necessity, but the idea that it relates to justice for sin of some sort is where I think there's a conflation. It can be justified through necessity. I'm not claiming that it's justified through sin. I don't believe children are necessary. I don't believe babies when they die of something sin.
Hmm.
That's sin of
Oh,
sorts.
oh,
So.
okay. So how is the suffering of children necessary in the eyes of God?
Well, let's put it like this: the claim of Epicurus requires that it be unnecessary suffering, right? Like this is a necessity. So, for example, when he says that, why would he do so? Why is there suffering? Why is he unable to stop it? Right? Like let's say hypothetically the answer to that was maybe, right? Not the, and that wouldn't necessarily be a question of omnipotence, right? Would they be like, is that an omnipotent issue? Like, let's say that God is unable to do so. Is that necessarily an issue of omnipotence, or is that possibly another issue of sorts? So, if evil is a necessity, if suffering is a necessity, even on those who are religiously innocent, let's say like children, for example,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is it possible that the inability to stop that from happening is because it's a necessity, and that the necessity of it is something that's outside of omnipotence? So like, for example, let's take something paradoxical. So like, there's the
It
common.
sounds pretty paradoxical there. You're saying that there's something that an all powerful being can't do because it's outside of the ability of the all powerful being to do.
Well, no, not at all. It's that, I mean, there are things that God cannot do, and that isn't a restriction on God's power, but it's by necessary paradox. So, like, for example, like, can God create a circle with edges, right? Like these are like linguistically and definitionally paradox things. Like this isn't a lack of power on God, like, because if he was to create what you imagine that would look like, if you could, right, like that would not fall under the definition of circle or square, right? And that is an omnipotence issue. Like, could you do so, or do you lack capability? Like, what would require to do so? And you'd realize that it's not necessarily a lack of capability. Like, I could give you as much wood and a table saw as possible, and a nice like measuring tape or any tool you require, and you wouldn't be able to do so. And that's not out of a lack of material or capability. It's just because it's paradoxical in nature. So if it is possible that the necessity of evil is a necessity and is unable to be stopped out of a paradoxical relationship with something else, then it isn't an issue of omnipotence. It then just becomes an issue of paradox, and that would explain why evil exists in a necessary fashion, without having to question God's power.
So God doesn't have the evil. Sorry, mixed up words there. God doesn't have the power to prevent evil. Is that what you're saying?
No, you didn't. Well, I mean, I think that's like a very loaded question. Like, does God have the power to create a circle with edges? Like, if I answer no to that, is that an issue of omnipotence, or is that a paradoxical issue? Well, it's obviously a paradoxical issue, because if I asked you if you're capable of doing so, is it because you're not physically capable of doing so? Do you not have the means to do so, or is it because it's not a capable thing? Like, its incapability is not the result of a lacking on your part, but of its paradoxical nature. So if you want to like ask that in like a proper way that isn't a big loaded question, is it possible that evil is a necessity that God isn't necessarily able to stop? Or maybe he is, but it would be contradictory or paradoxical to something else? Yeah, possibly.
What would it?
And that would,
What would it contradict himself?
well, it wouldn't. Well, it could contradict himself in some fashion, but I wouldn't be too sure about saying that. I think that's pretty loaded. Who knows? I don't think. I mean, it's kind of when it's a more of like a metaphysical issue. It could be contradictory to the nature of the universe, and to some extent, right? Like maybe the will to, let's say, eliminate evil becomes paradoxical to what is considered to be good, or what is considered to be maximizing the universe. I'm not sure. I don't think there's like a proper answer to that question. But if it's possible, like if there's issues of paradox, that omnipotence is not the issue, then it's, I mean, it's a possibility.
Okay, so then let's dig into this with the children's dying of cancer.
Yeah.
It's paradoxically outside of God's power to prevent children from dying from cancer.
Well,
Help me
it's
understand
not.
this.
So I mean, let's put it like this, like oh, man, I can't give any more examples with the square and the circle. I'm beating that one to death. So let's put it like this. Let's say that the suffering is necessary of some sort. Like this would be the only explainable reason. Like under Christian doctrine, there is no unnecessary suffering, right? All unnecessary suffering, if it isn't a necessity of some sort, should be eliminated by a God with these omni qualities that we agree upon at the very beginning, right? So.
Yeah.
From my position, all suffering is a necessary one. So why is it a necessity? Like, where does this necessity come from? Well, I mean,
That would
I can't.
logically follow, and God being the all powerful one, you'd assume the buck stops with him being the highest authority.
Well, I mean, but keep in mind, God also has authority. God only has authority over things that he has, like, that there aren't contradictions of paradox. Like you wouldn't say the buck stops at God to make a circle that has edges. I'm saying that there is a possible reason that is outside of perception, that the nature of the universe requires some form of necessary evil, even if it goes on to, let's say, people that we wouldn't use it as a justice, right? Like people that are innocent, perhaps, and eliminating it is paradoxical to what is essential for the universe, right? Like, it is possible that this is true, and like, I'm not really sure how you could disprove that. Now, I'm not saying this is absolute. I am not using this to necessarily prove the existence of God. I'm just saying arguments of evil make the fundamental assumption that all evil is either unnecessary, or that there's categories of necessary and unnecessary when it relates to suffering, and that suffering and its effects must physically manifest, right? Like I don't agree with these
Well,
assumptions.
I don't know, because I feel like, children dying of cancer or dying of hunger feels like a pretty unnecessary thing that I feel
Well, I mean,
like,
I'm glad, but
because
how?
we're now appealing to like some cosmic paradox of the universe that prevents God from intervening in feeding children who are about to die
You
of
you
hunger.
you you were
Or
asking for an explanation for why this could possibly be true, and you might define it as an unnecessary form of suffering, but you have to make the fundamental assumption that you were making the fundamental assumption that you can distinguish unnecessary suffering from some necessary suffering. And where does this fundamental assumption come from? Like how could you possibly look at something and say that this is unnecessary in the scope of the universe because I am aware of the paradoxes? Like
yeah,
you're not like.
if
So like it's
if
like I mean
something is
I think there's
necessary,
a
you'd
level of
have to
absurdity
prove
to
that
that.
first.
Say
You
again?
you'd have to demonstrate that the suffering is necessary.
No, that's not how it works. That's not how the argumentation. You are making the fundamental assumption that there is unnecessary suffering, and I'm asking you, what gives you this idea that there are these distinguishable categories of suffering? Is it not possible that all of it is necessary? Like, and you just can't tell?
To which I would turn to you and say, can you prove that it's necessary?
That's not how argument. Well,
My
no.
position
That's
is
not
the
how.
null position.
That's not how argumentation works. You're taking an ambiguous position, but it's not really that ambiguous. You are making the fundamental assumption that you can perceive, or that unnecessary suffering must take a physical manifestation, that you can tell what that is. Like you think that unnecessary suffering manifests itself into cases that you believe shouldn't like suffer, like innocent children, for example. And I am saying this fundamental assumption is like it's questionable. Like I don't think there's any basis for it. When you say that this child is suffering unnecessarily, what does it mean? Like how do you know for exactly? Like isn't that based off of what is that based off of? Like what perception of something can you possibly base it off? Is it possible that you don't see it? Like I mean, let's just say,
Well, if we're
just to like
talking about
emphasize
my
this.
moral precepts, I do see suffering as a inherently bad thing
Well, I
that
mean,
should be
well,
avoided.
wait. No one says no, no. If God said suffering was good, then I would disagree with God, right? That would be a disagreement. Well, I mean, my disagreement would have no basis because God would obviously be right. But I mean, I would find this to be a little bit of a bigger issue. But God isn't necessarily claiming that suffering is good, and I'm not claiming that either. I'm simply saying that it's possible that suffering is necessary. Like, like not all necessities are
Okay,
good.
but you see how saying that it's necessary is a bigger reach than saying it's unnecessary.
No, why? This is off the fundamental assumption that you can physically see the manifestations of suffering, and that you can distinguish them from necessary and unnecessary suffering. And I don't believe this to be true. Like you say that listen to your claim. Like, at the end of the day, this is your claim. I am capable of distinguishing necessary suffering from unnecessary suffering, even though I have no idea
Okay,
why suffering exists.
let me
Like I can tell this is bad suffering. How does
then
that make
let
sense?
me lay out how I think about it.
Sure. Sure.
Unnecessary suffering, to me, is all suffering that is not necessary. If suffering is necessary, it must be justified. There has to be a reason. But if it
Sure.
doesn't have a reason, then to me it is unnecessary suffering.
Sure. You basically just defined like you just defined the word necessity and then applied it to the word suffering.
A
Yes,
little
I
bit.
agree. This is how that works. Suffering that isn't justified isn't defined as a necessity.
Yeah,
Then like I
which is why when you say I can't tell if it's necessary or unnecessary, my response is, well, you'd have to justify it being necessary before I
No,
justify it being
no, pause. You wouldn't have to
unnecessary.
justify it being necessary. You make the fundamental assumption that it is unnecessary. Now, I'm asking you, how do you know it's unnecessary? Well, your response is, or the reasoning behind it, if we were to dig a little bit deeper, is because you don't believe that there's any reason why a child's suffering. Like for you, you'll probably give me, if I gave you a bunch of examples, if we went down the rabbit hole, right, of like, what about this example? What about this example? We would eventually get to an example. I'm just going to skip 10 steps. We would get to the example where you go, what about a person who literally lives alone. Nobody knows. It affects nobody. Their suffering affects nobody, and they suffer. They get crushed by a fucking tree in the middle of the woods, and no one knows they died. No one's ever met them, and they suffer. How could that suffering be a necessity? That is inevitably what we would talk about, because you would just go down the rabbit hole where eventually you find a way to basically say that this person's suffering isn't necessary of some sorts. And I would disagree with this. I say, well, no. This is under the fundamental assumption that suffering manifests itself in a physical form. Like, that suffering has to manifest in a physical form for it to be justified. And that is why you don't think that children or babies or people that die in the wood by themselves are necessary suffering, because you don't believe it to be justified, and you don't believe it to be justified because it doesn't have a physical manifestation. And that assumption is based on the idea that suffering has to physically manifest itself in some way that you can perceptually see. And I disagree with this assumption, because to say that is to automatically assume that it's unnecessary. Like you believe that necessity is based off the perception of justification. I don't believe this is true. It is possible that justice is an unperceivable thing, that the justification for the suffering isn't one that can be perceived by us and doesn't have any form of physical manifestations. And it is because of that that it's possibly necessary. Now, I'm not claiming to know this to be true. I'm just simply saying, when someone says this thing dying is unnecessary, I would say I don't know if that is true. It is possible that it isn't. And we know it's possible that it isn't because we can say that it might be paradoxical to the nature of something. And if that is true, then it is a paradox that God is not capable of solving, that isn't a problem of omnipotence or omnibenevolence, and that it would also explain why it has no physical manifestations. There's also yeah. Continue.
No, I'm trying to break down what you said, because
Go ahead.
So you're not even going off of like anything might have God have said, or you're going off of the idea that we can't even possibly perceive the concept of justice, therefore we can't come to any conclusions about whether or not any suffering is justified or unjustified.
Correct. Yeah, this is what
feels like a lot of word salad to escape a problem with God. Like,
no, it seems like a pretty rational thing, considering the fact that your fundamental basis for understanding suffering as a necessity is based off of some form of perception. Like, if you acknowledge the fact that something metaphysical could be happening, like the nature of the universe, and that it's not something that we can perceptually see as monkeys that came out of the trees 2,000 years ago, then it's physically possible that suffering has a purpose. It's not perceivable by our monkey brains, and it is because of that that all suffering is capable of being necessary and therefore justified. And it wouldn't necessarily be a contradiction of any of the omni-qualities, because if it is a necessity of the universe, then it might be paradoxical to something else.
Yeah,
so it isn't an issue of omnipotence.
Every time you make the same jump, you're saying it could possibly be necessary.
Yes, because that is like the question of Epicurus. Like, he literally says, from whence they come from. Like, where is it coming from? Like, how is this possible? It's not necessarily a dilemma. He acknowledges that if these omni-qualities are true, and this is the part. If these are true, and he states this very clearly, if both these qualities are true, then why is it necessary that this exists? Right, and this is response. Like, everything I've said, it goes in correspondence with omni-qualities, and it is rational to an extent. Like you don't perceive everything. Like, that is what metaphysics is. Like, not everyone perceives everything. This is a perfectly rational sense. Justice isn't something that's perceptual, right? Like, you can't necessarily see justice. You can say that you see justice manifest into a physical way, like when someone goes to jail for killing people. That might be your idea of justice manifesting itself. But justice isn't a perceptual thing. Like, you can't hand me a justice, and you can't perceive a justice. It's not
like a rock. Right? It's a concept.
Yeah.
It's a school of philosophy.
So it is possible that there is a concept of justice that isn't something that physically manifests itself, and it is the result of some form of suffering. That is a perfectly rational thing. If you think that someone going to jail for raping somebody is a justice that physically manifests itself, then why is it not possible that there's other forms of justice that just don't manifest, or at least they don't manifest in a way we can see? It's possible it actually manifests, but perhaps we just don't see it. Like that. Why is that such an unbelievable position? Like, you can't see other forms of justice, but you believe things are just, right? Like, sometimes just things don't even manifest. Like, I'm sure if we sat here for long enough, we could come up with examples of things that we agree are justice that don't necessarily manifest themselves in physical things that I can hand you. right? Like, so, like, I don't, and even so, even if we couldn't do so, we couldn't prove that that doesn't happen. Like, where does this fundamental assumption come from that all justice is like tangible? Like, it's not. Like, how so? How do you know? So I think this is a perfectly reasonable response. I don't see very many issues to this.
Well, because I
If this
think
is
we've moved away from like the Platonic conceptual idea of justice when we were initially talking about, hey, suffering and we didn't even get into like the whole evil. I moved straight into just the unnecessary suffering
well,
suffered in the
I think
world.
evil and suffering are somewhat synonymous. I will use them
There's a lot of
synonymous.
overlap, but we
Yeah.
can say that there
No,
is
I agree.
some evil that
You
isn't
know, I
suffering.
agree. I'm not going to sit here and say the same thing. I'm just saying to clarify
Yeah.
if there is any confusion. I am
Okay.
using them synonymously for the moment.
And we have to go here soon. So I'll close out with I'll tell you my perspective as an
Sure.
atheist, my perspective on this stuff.
Sure.
To me, I don't have to justify or play defense for any higher power. I'm just a human around the world with lots of other humans. When earthquakes collapse school buildings and things like that,
Yeah.
I see that as an unfortunate reality of the world we live in, nature outside of our control, and that the best we humans can do is try and make the world a better place in an unfair world. Um, but I see it as a fundamental problem of religions that do appeal to a higher power, that has all the power, that is supposed to be loving, that
Mhm.
that they sit idly by and let all this suffering go unabated.
Sure.
Because if I was God, I'd be boots on the ground, stopping those earthquakes, stopping those hurricanes, curing
Oh yeah.
cancer. You know, I'd be out, I'd be active, I'd be doing stuff, but we don't really see that.
Well, you're perfectly capable of doing plenty of things, to help other people, but you choose to sit at a computer and play Rainbow Six Siege as well. So I don't necessarily know if that's true,
I
but
volunteer at a food bank, and I'm trying to
that's true.
get
But
through college
I've seen your
to.
desktop. You have plenty of games. You just buy games and don't play them.
Unsurprisingly, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean everyone does that. Some games are fucking trash, and you realize that when you buy them. But yeah, but no. I mean, listen. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to you. That was more of a whip than anything.
Yeah.
Have a good one, Bob. Um, but yeah, I would just simply say, I mean, I understand the complaint, but I don't believe the idea that we're doing nothing, that like us as Christians we're just sitting around and like no, like
No, I'm not.
I'm
I don't mean
actively
to
trying to
imply that
justify this.
Christians do nothing. I've met many Christians who are very charitable at heart. I'm just saying that this is a problem with their concept of the Christian God, of why does he seem so
Well,
absent when
I think it's I think it's an interesting question, but I don't I think that listen, there's 2,000 years of theology,
mm,
there's hundreds of years of epistemology, there's I mean thousands of philosophies that have been lost at time, right? Like
mm,
the idea that the question of evil and suffering can be like closed in like a 20-minute fashion is absurd. The idea that it can be closed in like a 100-year fashion is absurd. Like I am just saying what I can believe, like what is possible. Like what I understand to be possible is this. Like
mm.
I don't know everything, and I think that is a perfectly valid claim. And it is
Okay.
because I don't know everything that I can't perceive everything, and that's a perfectly acknowledgeable claim. And I think that we have a bunch of assumptions, and what these assumptions are that things that are justice manifest. Like when we say, "Man, justice has been served," like that is because we think justice has manifested itself in a way that it's like, well, there it is, like boom, like that was necessary. Like look at that, we saw that happen, and this is what we wanted to happen. But I think that that's a little bit of a monkey brain take. Like I'm glad we have things like that because I'm glad we can see that justice comes about. Because the world would kind of suck ass if justice never manifested in some form of way.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not going to be so monkey brain to say that I know all forms of justice and that I know for a fact when it manifests itself. Because you know what? It's possible that justice doesn't do so, and that it doesn't manifest in a physical way that I can see. And
Oh,
I think the saying "I don't know," but I can't label things as stuff like necessary and not is a little bit absurd. Like I just think that like if we can both agree that there is an absurdity to saying that you know everything, then I think saying that maybe we don't know if all suffering is unnecessary. Maybe all suffering is just necessary, and like there's a reason why. Like I think that's a perfectly acceptable claim because what qualifies you? Like what qualifications do you or I have to know whether or not suffering is necessary? Like because we don't see it. Like that's
Well,
really the basis for it. I mean, that's kind of like a, you know what I mean? Like
okay.
at the end of the day, like
We gotta
if we
close out, bud. We gotta close out, bud.
yeah, I know. I'll wrap it up like this. At the end of the day, when you ask what your if you had to list your qualifications on a piece of paper for how you would know whether or not something is necessary or not, we would just basically come up with I saw it happen or I believe it, right? And I think both of those are really monkey brain. So I think it's perfectly acceptable to be like, I don't know, it's capable of not being necessary. I don't think I can judge, and maybe it just doesn't manifest, and maybe we just don't see it. And you know what? I think that's a perfectly acceptable answer because I don't even know.
All right.
Like I don't even know there's a snake next to me. There probably is, right? Like I'm
Okay.
monkey brained.
All
So
right. One of the most pleasant conversations we've had thus far. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for your time.
I have
Be
cheese all
well.
over my fingers. Goodbye.
Okay. Um, Actually, that was one of the most pleasant conversations we've had. Um, let's see. Going over that brief discussion. Um, yeah. So, okay. I think I would close out with this. Um, the Christian God asks us to praise Him. And I think if we are to accept that God is all loving and God is all powerful, and that He really is worthy of worship, um, we'd have to see Him justify why He does not get involved in human suffering. Why does He not, um, you know, why does He not cure kids of cancer? Why do people suffer unnecessarily? Because if He's supposed to be all powerful and He's supposed to be all loving, and if there is something, some paradoxical power that is somehow preventing Him from interacting with, human suffering, then a if your child ever gets cancer, praying to Him's not going to be of any use. We can't ascribe Him to be responsible for, we can't thank God if the doctors, through skillful hands, save the child from cancer or the child miraculously recovers. Um, or anything like that. We can't really ascribe that to God because we don't know if God is responsible or not. Um, Honestly, if it feels like yeah, if God is all powerful but cannot interact with human suffering, cannot stop a child from suffering from cancer or some great disease or dying in an earthquake or anything like that, then that kind of takes the bite out of His all powerfulness, and He's not really a useful God, that at the very least. Um, so yeah, I think if there is something preventing God that He can't get involved in human affairs, um, He'd have to spell that out if He wants me to worship Him at the very least. But anyways, um, that's today's show. It's a lot shorter than normal. I'm sorry for that. Hopefully, I'll be doing more interviews soon. That's going to be really exciting. I'm just really crammed between working part time. I'm starting college soon. I try and volunteer at my local food bank, as I mentioned, and I make videos every single day. So my schedule's a little tight right now. Um, but with that, be well. My Patreon and Discord, where you can debate me, is all linked below. And with that, have a good day. Have a good day.